Part 2. I barely slept that night. John's words echoed in my mind, replaying over and over like a loop I couldn't escape. They are getting closer. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was it true? Were these creatures really drawing closer to human settlements? Were they really as dangerous as John said? I couldn't afford to ignore it. The next morning, I found myself doing what I promised myself I wouldn't. I was heading back into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see for myself, to understand what was going on. It wasn't enough to just hear John's warnings. I needed to know. As I packed my gear into the truck, I thought about the warnings, about the fact that I had barely escaped with my life the first time. But something inside me was pulling me back, something telling me that this wasn't over. I didn't want to go alone, so I called Jim. He was the only person I could trust to understand what I was going through. "Jim, I need your help," I said when he picked up. "I think I've found something. I need to go back to the woods. There's something there, something I can't explain." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "I thought you were done with that place," he said. "I thought you were over it." "I don't think I can be," I replied. "I need to know what's really going on, and you're the only one who might understand." Jim hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "All right, but I'm not going in there unprepared. I'll grab my gear, but we need to stay focused. We don't know what's out there, and we don't know what we're up against." I agreed. We couldn't afford to make mistakes this time. We met at the edge of the woods, the sun starting to dip below the horizon. The familiar feeling of unease crept up my spine as I stepped out of the truck. The air was thick with tension, and the woods seemed quieter than I remembered, almost too quiet. Jim and I didn't waste any time. We grabbed our equipment and made our way deeper into the forest. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the fading light. The closer we got to the spot where I had encountered the creature, the more nervous I became. But we pressed on. Jim kept glancing around nervously, his hand on the handle of his backpack. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered under his breath. "It feels wrong." I didn't disagree. There was an oppressive silence in the air, a heaviness that weighed on everything around us. We reached the clearing where I'd seen the creature, the spot where I'd had my closest call. I stopped, scanning the area, looking for any signs of movement. The ground was still soft, damp from a recent rain, and the trees around us stood like silent sentinels, watching us with eerie stillness. "Do you feel that?" Jim asked quietly. I nodded. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. The air felt charged, like something was watching us. Then we heard it, a low, distant growl, something that seemed to rumble deep within the earth, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. My stomach twisted in dread. "Do you think it's here?" Jim whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't know. I couldn't be sure. But I knew we weren't alone. Suddenly, we heard a rustling noise from behind us. I spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing, just the dark shadows of the trees. Jim's voice trembled. "We should go back. This is not worth it." But I couldn't move. I had to find out what was going on. And then we heard something else, a crackling sound like dry branches snapping underfoot. But it wasn't coming from the direction we'd just been looking. It was coming from behind us, deeper in the woods. I felt my heart stop. It was close. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking, but before I could turn it on, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving swiftly through the trees. A low growl, followed by a thud as if something heavy was approaching. I turned to Jim. "We need to go now. Run." We didn't need to say anything else. We both turned and bolted through the woods, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of heavy footsteps followed us, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every passing second. I glanced over my shoulder for just a moment and saw something in the distance. A figure, massive and shadowed, just outside the reach of my flashlight's beam. It was too close. We sprinted harder, the thudding of our feet drowned out by the growls that now echoed around us, coming from every direction. I knew I was about to make the same mistake I had made before, but there was no turning back. We had to outrun it. Jim was ahead of me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's gaining on us," he shouted. "Go faster!" I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but I couldn't outrun the fear that was crawling up my spine. Just when I thought we couldn't run any farther, the sound stopped. The growls faded into the distance. The footsteps no longer followed us. We stopped, gasping for air, the darkness of the forest closing in around us. I looked at Jim, and we both exchanged a look of disbelief. "It's not over," I said, my voice hoarse. "We need to leave. Now." We didn't stay in the woods any longer. We ran back to the truck as fast as we could, the feeling of being chased never leaving us. As we pulled out of the forest and onto the main road, I looked back, half expecting to see the creature following us. But there was nothing, just the endless darkness of the trees. Jim said nothing the whole way home. We both knew what we had experienced, but neither of us wanted to speak about it. I wasn't sure how long we could keep running, because whatever it was still out there. The drive back to town was a blur, the headlights cutting through the dark as if trying to push away the ominous thoughts that clouded my mind. My hands were clenched tightly around the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I kept expecting to see something in the rearview mirror, a shadow, a movement, but nothing ever appeared. The silence in the truck was suffocating. Jim hadn't said a word since we left the woods, and I didn't know what to say either. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we had just experienced. Was it real? Could we have imagined it? I wanted to convince myself it was all just our minds playing tricks, the paranoia and fear making us see things. But the growls, the sounds of something massive moving just behind us, there was no denying it. When we finally reached town, I parked the truck in my driveway and turned off the engine. The weight of what had happened settled over me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. I looked at Jim. "What now?" I asked, my voice strained. Jim let out a long breath, his face pale. "We've got to tell someone. We can't just pretend it didn't happen. People need to know." I frowned. "Who would believe us?" Jim shook his head. "I don't know, but we can't just keep this to ourselves. If it's out there, if it's real, we have to do something." I stared at him for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. He was right, in a way. But I knew telling anyone would open a whole new can of worms, the disbelief, the ridicule. No one would take us seriously. They'd write us off as crazy, or worse, as attention-seeking liars. But we couldn't just ignore it. "I'll think about it," I said finally, though I wasn't sure what to think. Jim nodded, his face grim. "Just be careful, all right? I don't think we've seen the last of whatever that thing is." I didn't argue. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew he was right. We hadn't seen the last of it. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the house settling around me. The darkness outside seemed to press against the walls, as if the woods were still out there, waiting. I kept hearing that growl in my mind, replaying it over and over. It had been so close, so real. And yet, part of me still wondered if I had imagined it all, if the fear had gotten the better of me. But there was no denying what I felt. The terror, the sense of being hunted. I couldn't shake it. The next morning, I went into town. The sun was up, but the weight of what had happened still hung over me like a storm cloud. I went to the diner for coffee, hoping the normalcy of it would ground me. When I walked in, I saw that Jim was already sitting at a booth, staring down at his coffee. He didn't look up as I approached. I slid into the seat across from him. "Anything new?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He shook his head, his eyes tired. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about last night." "I know the feeling," I replied, staring down at my own cup. We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of what had happened between us. Finally, Jim spoke again. "I talked to a guy last night, someone I know who's into all this cryptid stuff. He says he's heard rumors about things like this happening in other parts of the country. But it's always been hush-hush. People don't want to believe it, so they ignore it." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of rumors?" Jim looked around, lowering his voice. "People disappearing. People seeing strange creatures. It's all connected. I think it's bigger than just the woods. This thing, whatever it is, could be part of something even more terrifying." I swallowed hard. "You think it's been happening for a while?" Jim nodded. "Maybe even longer than we realize. But the more we talk about it, the more we risk bringing attention to ourselves. I don't know about you, but I'm not ready to be the next person who disappears." I couldn't argue with that. We were already in deep, and the more we talked about it, the more dangerous it seemed. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went back to the woods once more, not to search, but to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. I stood at the edge of the trees, staring into the dark depths, listening for any sign of movement, but heard nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was out there, watching, waiting. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the ground, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to my normal life. Not now. Not when I knew what was out there. I had to find out more. I had to know the truth. And that meant facing whatever was lurking in those woods once again. The following days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the creature, about the forest, about the terrifying growl that had haunted my dreams. Jim was the only person who seemed to understand, and even he was starting to get nervous about continuing this. But something deep inside me refused to let it go. I needed to know what was going on, and I wasn't about to let fear stand in the way. I made a decision. I would return to the woods alone this time. Jim had agreed to help the first time, but I could see the fear in his eyes now. He didn't want to go back, and I didn't want to drag him into something worse. I packed my gear, grabbed a rifle for safety, just in case, and drove back to the spot where we had encountered the creature. The truck's headlights sliced through the dark as I approached the edge of the woods. My stomach was in knots. The place felt different this time, more oppressive, more alive. When I parked, I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. The familiar silence of the woods was suffocating, pressing down on me as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I stepped out of the truck, the cool night air biting at my skin. The forest looked the same as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now. It was like I was being watched, like the trees themselves were waiting for me to make a move. I walked toward the clearing, my boots crunching the leaves beneath me, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As I approached, I felt a sudden rush of unease. There was something here. I could feel it in the air, an electric charge, a tension that had never been there before. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring into the darkness. There was nothing. No growls, no sounds of movement. But I knew it was out there. I called out, my voice trembling slightly, "I'm here. I know you're out there." Silence. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear nothing except for my own breathing. Then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard it. A faint rustle in the trees behind me, followed by a low growl. My blood froze. I spun around, but again, I saw nothing. The growl sounded closer this time, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath me. I raised the rifle instinctively, my grip tightening around the stock. I heard more rustling, louder now, and then something moved in the shadows, a massive shape just outside the reach of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. It was huge. The creature stepped forward slowly, its massive form emerging from the darkness. It was covered in dark fur, and I could see the glint of its eyes in the weak light, gleaming like shards of glass. It didn't move like an animal, though. It moved with purpose, almost like it was watching me, studying me. My heart was racing now, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. It was so unlike anything I had ever seen. It was too big to be a bear, too strange to be anything I recognized. I took a slow step back, trying not to provoke it. I was frozen with a mix of fear and awe. Then it made a sound, almost a sigh, a low exhale of breath, and for a moment, I thought it might leave, but instead it began to approach. I was no longer sure what I should do. My mind was racing, and all I could think about was how to escape. I wasn't equipped to face whatever this was head-on. I took another step back, and the creature followed. It was only a few feet away now. I could see the details, its long arms, its broad chest, its terrifying size. Then, just as I thought it was going to strike, it stopped. The growl came again, but this time it wasn't threatening. It was almost like a warning. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body locked in place. I took another step back, my rifle still raised. The creature just watched me, its eyes never leaving mine. Suddenly, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as silently as it had come. I didn't breathe again until it was gone, and even then, my body trembled with the realization of what had just happened. I stood there in the clearing, the air thick with the weight of the encounter. I had just been face to face with something I couldn't explain, something that didn't belong in this world. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I found the strength to turn and walk back toward the truck. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to get out of the woods. I climbed into the truck, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. But as I drove away, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't done with this. Whatever it wasn't finished with me either. I drove for what felt like hours, but when I finally reached the edge of the forest, the eerie feeling didn't fade. My hands still trembled on the wheel, and every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see a shadow moving in the dark. I couldn't shake the image of the creature's eyes, those gleaming orbs that seemed to burn through me, as if it could see straight into my soul. I kept wondering why it hadn't attacked, why it had let me go. But I couldn't answer that. All I knew was that I was in way over my head. When I got back to town, I didn't bother going to my house first. Instead, I drove straight to Jim's place. I had to tell him. He was the only one who knew what I was dealing with. And even though he hadn't wanted to go back to the woods, I needed his help now more than ever. I knocked on his door, my heart racing. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath, like the whole world was watching. Jim opened the door, his tired eyes immediately scanning my face. "Did you go back?" he asked before I could say a word. I nodded. "Yeah, and I saw it. The creature. It's real, Jim." He looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he stepped aside to let me in. I sat down at the kitchen table, still shaking. Jim made coffee without saying anything, his movements slow, deliberate. "You didn't get hurt, right?" he asked after a moment. I shook my head. "No. It didn't attack, but it was so close, Jim. I could feel it. I could feel its breath on me." Jim sat across from me, his gaze heavy. "What are we going to do about this? I don't think we can just keep pretending like nothing happened." I stared into my coffee cup, my mind spinning. What could we do? I hadn't exactly walked away from this unscathed, but at least I had come back. There were no answers, no clear path forward, just more questions. "Do you think it's connected to all those rumors we've been hearing?" I asked. Jim didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "I don't know, but I think whatever it is, it's not the only one. The thing I saw, it didn't act like an animal. It was too intelligent, too aware of us, like it was waiting for something." I nodded slowly, my thoughts racing. If there was more than one of these creatures, then we were dealing with something bigger than we could understand. It wasn't just some random animal in the woods, it was a part of something larger. "I can't go back there," Jim said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not ready to risk my life over something I don't even understand. We need to tell people, but I know no one will believe us." I didn't argue. He was right. No one would believe us. They'd call us crazy, or worse, liars. And even if we did manage to convince someone, what could they do? We didn't have any evidence, just our word. "I'm going to keep looking," I said after a long pause. "I need to know what's going on. I need to know what that thing was and why it let me go." Jim sighed. "I can't stop you, but I think you're getting in way too deep. We're just regular people, man. We're not equipped to deal with something like this." I met his gaze, my resolve hardening. I have to know the truth, Jim. Even if no one believes us, even if we're the only ones who ever know what's out there. I have to understand. Jim didn't say anything. He just nodded, as if he knew there was no stopping me now. For the rest of the night, we sat in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Whatever we had seen in the woods, whatever had followed us, it wasn't going to let us go so easily. As I left Jim's house and made my way back to my own, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch felt like it was coming from behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. The creature hadn't followed me, not yet. But I knew that wasn't the end of it. I couldn't run from this. I had to face whatever was out there, and I had to do it alone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The images of the creature, the sounds, the weight of everything that had happened kept swirling in my mind, a constant loop I couldn't escape. I tossed and turned in bed, every shadow in my room feeling like it was lurking, waiting for me to slip up. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around and let fear dictate my actions. I had already gone this far, and I wasn't about to stop now. By morning, I had made up my mind. I would return to the woods. But this time, I wouldn't be going in blind. I needed answers, and I wasn't sure where else to turn. I pulled out the map I'd kept in my truck, the one that had marked off the spots where strange occurrences had been reported. There were a few places nearby that seemed to hold some kind of significance, areas where people had disappeared, or where strange, unexplainable things had been seen. One of those places was near an old abandoned logging camp deep in the forest. It was a place I had never visited before, but the reports from locals about odd sounds, strange footprints, and rumors of something moving in the night caught my attention. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I had to check it out. By midday, I was packed up and heading out to the woods once more. The sun was high, but the air felt heavy, thick with the same kind of tension I had felt before. I wasn't sure if it was the place or just my nerves, but something didn't feel right. The drive was long, and the roads were winding and narrow, each turn taking me deeper into unfamiliar territory. The trees seemed to close in on me the further I went, their branches casting shadows that felt far too dark for daylight. When I finally arrived at the old logging camp, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The place was eerily still, no signs of life, no sounds of animals or birds. The camp itself was nothing more than a few crumbling buildings and overgrown paths, forgotten by time. But it wasn't the buildings that drew me in. It was the strange energy in the air. I parked the truck at the edge of the clearing and got out, my boots crunching the dry leaves beneath me. I pulled out my flashlight and began walking toward the center of the camp. The further I went, the more oppressive the air seemed. It felt like I was being watched, like something unseen was lurking just beyond my sight. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, but the deeper I went into the camp, the more I felt like I was being drawn to something. It wasn't a feeling of curiosity, it was more like an instinct, a pull that I couldn't ignore. Then I saw it. There, just ahead, was a set of large footprints. They were deeply imprinted in the ground, and the strange thing was, they weren't human. The toes were too wide, the heels too pronounced. I knelt down and examined the tracks more closely. The size of them was unlike anything I had ever seen. They were far too big to belong to any known animal, and their shape, almost human-like, sent a shiver down my spine. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, my pulse quickening. The further I walked, the more the air seemed to change. It grew colder, as if the very atmosphere was rejecting my presence. The trees towered over me, their branches swaying in the wind, but there was no sound, not even the usual rustling of leaves. And then I heard it, a low growl. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it was almost right behind me. My heart raced as I whipped around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted back toward the camp, my breath ragged in my chest. I could hear something following me, moving through the underbrush with terrifying speed. I reached the truck, nearly tripping as I fumbled with the door handle. I jumped inside and slammed the door shut, locking it. I could still hear it out there, something large, something fast, moving in the shadows just beyond the trees. I didn't dare open the door to see what it was. I sat there, breathless, for what felt like an eternity, waiting for whatever it was to move on. Eventually, the sounds faded, and the forest fell silent again. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I started the truck and drove off, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline. I didn't stop until I was back in town. I knew I had found something, but I wasn't sure what it was. I didn't have any answers yet, but I knew this wasn't the end. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't done with me, and I wasn't done with it. It had been a few days since the encounter near the logging camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I stepped out of my house, every time I looked over my shoulder, the sensation that something was watching me crawled under my skin like an itch I couldn't scratch. I tried to keep myself busy, trying to focus on anything other than the growing anxiety gnawing at me. Jim had gone quiet, and I couldn't blame him. We both knew now that whatever we were dealing with was far bigger than we had imagined. But that didn't make it any easier. I kept reviewing the events in my head, trying to piece together some sort of pattern. The strange footprints, the growls, the feeling of being watched, it all pointed to something unnatural. But the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. What was this creature? Why had it been so careful not to harm me? What did it want? I didn't have answers yet, but I had one thing I could do. I needed to speak with people who might know more. There was an old hunter in town, an eccentric man who had lived in the area for most of his life. He was known for his stories, many of which were laughed off as the ramblings of an old man. But when it came to the forest and the creatures that lived there, he had a reputation for knowing things others didn't. I had heard whispers that he might know something about the creature I'd seen. So, against my better judgment, I drove to his cabin. The road leading to his place was rough, with branches scraping the side of my truck as I pushed through the thick woods. The cabin itself was isolated, hidden behind a wall of trees that made it look like it belonged to the land more than to any person. When I knocked on the door, I heard the shuffle of feet inside before the door creaked open. The old hunter stood there, his weathered face scrunched in suspicion. His eyes, sharp despite his age, studied me carefully. "Yeah?" he grumbled. "I need to talk," I said, my voice shaking more than I intended. "I've seen something. I need your help." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back and motioned for me to come inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and earth, the air thick with the scent of herbs and strange concoctions. It looked exactly like the kind of place someone who lived with the forest would call home, untidy but lived in, with weapons and hunting gear scattered throughout. I sat down at a wooden table, and the old man took a seat across from me, leaning in close. "So what is it you've seen?" he asked, his voice rough. I explained everything, the creature in the woods, the growl, the way it had moved, the strange footprints. I didn't leave anything out, not the fear I felt or the lingering feeling that something had changed in me ever since that night. When I finished, the old man sat back, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. For a long moment, he said nothing. I thought he might laugh, brush me off like the others had, but instead, he looked me square in the eye. "You've seen it," he said quietly. "The thing in the woods." My heart skipped a beat. "You know what it is?" He nodded slowly. "I don't know what it is, but I know what it's not." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not human. It's something older, something that's been here long before people started building towns and roads. We used to call it the Watcher, though it goes by many names. Some people say it's just a legend, something to scare the kids with. But it's real, and it's not something you want to mess with." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why? What does it want?" The old man's eyes darkened. "It doesn't want anything from you, not directly, but it's a guardian of the forest, and it won't tolerate anyone who disturbs the land. It's not territorial in the way an animal is. It doesn't hunt for food or revenge. It's there to keep things in balance. And if you've wandered too far into its domain, it's just letting you know, letting you see what's out there so you understand its power." My mind was racing, but I didn't mean to. He raised a hand to silence me. "I know you didn't, and it knows you didn't. That's why it hasn't killed you. But don't think for a second that it won't. If it feels threatened, if it feels you're disrupting something it's protecting, it will act. That's the last warning you'll get. Next time you go out there, it might not let you leave." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking into me like a stone in my stomach. "So what do I do?" The old man's eyes softened, just a little. "You leave it alone. You don't go back into the woods. You don't provoke it. You respect the land. It's not something you want to go looking for. And if you've seen it, you're already lucky to be alive." I nodded slowly, though part of me wasn't sure I could follow through. Something about the creature, about the forest, called to me. It wasn't just fear that drove me. It was a need to understand, to know the truth. But maybe he was right. Maybe I was in over my head. "Now go," he said, his voice firm, "before it knows you're here." I stood up, too shaken to argue. I didn't look back as I walked out of his cabin, my mind spinning with everything he had said. I had seen something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world, and I wasn't sure I could stay away from it, no matter how much I wanted to. End of part 2.